So the Dhamma for today is the teaching of all Buddhas. One way of summarizing Buddhism is to say simply that the teaching of all Buddhas is three things. Not doing any evil, being full of wholesomeness or good, and purifying the mind. This is a part of the Ovada Patimokkha, which is one of the more famous teachings throughout Theravada Buddhism. In whichever Theravada Buddhist country you go to, you'll find ordinary people who have learned the Dhamma, who will be familiar with these three aspects of the Buddhist teaching, or this threefold definition of Buddhism. It's simple, practical, and useful for sharing Buddhism with people, especially those who have no prior understanding or knowledge of it. It's not as deep or technical as, say, the Four Noble Truths, but much more approachable and understandable for newcomers. It's also practical in ways that the more deep theoretical teachings are not, whereas the theoretical teachings will help to direct you. They don't give you this comprehensive understanding of how to practice. So in terms of living your life. So here we have this very simple teaching, but very clear instruction on what it means to practice Buddhism, what is Buddhism, what it means to be a Buddhist. A Buddhist is someone who does these three things. It's remarkable, it shows how Buddhism is remarkable in two ways. First of all, in what it doesn't contain, and second of all, what it, of course, does contain. But you might miss what it doesn't contain as being a part of what's remarkable about it. It's a mistake, of course, to be overly theoretical about the Buddha's teaching, to think of it as something complex, something that requires deep philosophical thought, introspection, it takes time to consider and understand. Buddhism is much more about simplifying your life and therefore reality and the teachings, the direction that you take. The challenge in Buddhism is not understanding something complex. The challenge is in turning the complex into the simple and simplifying our lives, simplifying our minds. You notice how simple mindfulness is when you simply say to yourself, pain, pain when you have pain. It's not complex. It's hard for people to understand. They're trying to understand what is the deeper meaning behind it. And that the whole point is to stop you from trying to find meaning behind things. So in a way, this is a good example of how simple the Buddha's teaching is and how simplicity is important. But really what I mean by what isn't there is something much more obvious. It's the lack of any extraneous and superfluous beliefs or views. There's so much more that could be added to any set of teachings. And it should be familiar to all of us who are familiar to world religions and philosophies and spiritual paths. There's always so much more. There's always something added. You know, you can recognize the qualities here in other religious practices, spiritual practices, but they always have something extra, something that we would say in Buddhism is superfluous. The big one that comes to mind, of course, is God. The Buddha taught nothing about God, nothing about rituals or certain practices that you must do, nothing about abstract philosophical ideas about reality. What you'll find in every other religious tradition is something extra, something that veers you away from these very simple teachings. Buddhism is, as a rule, in contrast to many other teachings, something very simple, direct, and you might say ordinary, or rather something that relates only to ordinary reality. Buddha didn't talk about metaphysics or God. He didn't talk about the beginning of the universe, the end of the universe. He didn't talk about the past or the future, not completely avoiding them, but as far as his teachings went, it's very much the here and now, limited to the six senses, the five aggregates. You notice how again and again the Buddha would return to these. So before we talk about these three things, the first thing to note about Buddhism is that, this really is all there is. It really is just these three things. Now, all three of these are a huge challenge to accomplish, but they're mainly a challenge because of how much we complicate things. So the first lesson is to simplify. Someone asks you, what does Buddhism say? Buddhism is a religion of simplicity. It doesn't have any weird or strange or specific, odd, esoteric beliefs or rules or theories. It just has, in brief, three things: not doing evil, being full of good, and purifying the mind. So as far as what it has, if we go through these three, not doing any evil, simply referring to evil deeds could be performed by body, could be performed by speech, could be performed by mind. In the regular enumeration, there are 10 types of wrong deeds that one could possibly perform. 3 by body. You can kill, you can steal, you can commit adultery or sexual misconduct. And of course anything related to these, killing can relate to harming, of course, these are bad deeds. But any bad deed that you do with body generally comes under related to things like these: killing, stealing, sexual misconduct. Then there are the 4 verbal misdeeds. So lying, harsh speech, divisive speech, useless speech. Any kind of speech is a challenging one. It's very easy, of course, to have wrong speech. One thing to note about wrong speech, unlike wrong action, physical action, of course, killing and stealing and sexual misconduct are highly, highly reprehensible and are the very basis of what it means to be a Buddhist. But as far as speech goes, the only one we really emphasize is lying. The other 3 are bad. There's no way that will ever be good. But even a Sotapanna can still, even an enlightened being, someone on the first level of enlightenment, someone who has seen Nibbana, someone who has followed the path and practiced correctly, can still have harsh speech, can still have divisive speech, and of course can still have useless speech. So don't beat yourself up too much in regards to this, but the most important one, most crucial, sort of the minimum for someone to consider themselves to be following the Buddha's teaching, is to not tell a deliberate lie. After that, of course, it is the teaching of the Buddha to be careful about speech and to work on harsh speech, not hurting other people with speech, not saying something that makes someone upset, not saying something to bring fear or any kind of anger or sadness to others, not purposefully. Not to use divisive speech, speaking bad about someone else just for the purpose of splitting those people apart, making them think bad about that person. Of course, you can warn people about others, that's not a problem, but you have to be careful that you're not doing it just to make someone, you don't like this person and you want this other person to not like them as well, that sort of thing, or just to cause division between people. And useless speech, we do have to keep in mind that this is against the Buddha's teaching. And that from time to time, of course, with this one it's the worst because only an arahant can truly be free from it. But we still should try our best. Remember, this is the teaching of the Buddha. It's considered bad if we are to talk about things that have no purpose, that serve only to distract our listener, to divert their attention from what is important, that have no relation to our practice, even practically. So if we talk about politics, if we talk about sports, if we talk about even the weather, all of it, weather can be valuable to talk about, but simply talking for the sake of talking can be quite often useless and therefore harmful, because it leads to distraction, it leads to taxing of the mind of both the speaker and the listener. So this is wrong speech. And then there are three in the mind. In the mind, the three that are singled out, basically greed, anger, and delusion, but how the Buddha worded it in terms of wrong deeds. One is abhijja, which means desire or lust or passion, craving after things. The second is bhayapada, which means ill will. So when you feel anger towards others, hatred, when you hold a grudge, that sort of thing. And finally, wrong view. So when someone in their mind gives rise to wrong view. These 10 you could see are the most obvious examples of wrong action. It can be with body, with speech, or with mind. And the point being that even in the mind, a wrong deed would be the arising of, say, a wrong view, or the arising of a craving for something, the arising of an anger towards a person. Obviously, we know that at the very heart of this, it's all about their state of mind. You would only kill, you would only steal, you would only commit a sexual misconduct or wrong speech if your mind is polluted. But for practical purposes, the Buddha still taught in relation to action. He still taught that killing is wrong, because for practical purposes, simply telling people not to get angry or greedy or deluded is not nearly enough. We need concrete examples. We need to be able to understand what is happening when we get angry, when we get greedy, to be able to find these defilements and to be able to understand them. We have to see from the very beginning which actions are related to unwholesomeness. So when we understand that killing is wrong, we can start to investigate and see how we feel and see the difference between our state of mind when we do an unwholesome deed, we perform killing or stealing, or when we do a wholesome deed. So the second teaching is on being full of wholesome. And he doesn't say goodness, he uses the word kusala, which I don't think we have to look too much into it. It's more like a rhetorical choice of words. But the ordinary understanding is that this is, of course, just the opposite of evil. So the opposite of evil is goodness, but the Buddha used the word kusala. And he didn't say performing kusala, he said being full of kusala. And I don't want to read too much into this, but I will say one thing. It'd be different from unwholesomeness. When you talk about evil, the absolute non-performance of evil, it's sort of saying that it's something that you should absolutely never do, but you can't say the opposite about goodness, or you don't necessarily say the opposite about goodness, that you have to do or must do all sorts of good things. It's not really false, and in fact, as a Buddhist, your best bet is to be constantly, as much as you can, trying to do good deeds. But still, it's not the same thing, because a person, practically speaking, need not do huge number of, can dispense with doing a huge number of different kinds of good deeds simply by living alone, living in the forest, living a simple life. A person, on the other hand, who lives in society will be forced to constantly be confronted with opportunities where they can either do good deeds or refuse to do good deeds, and as a result they're going to find themselves caught up in a lot of wholesomeness. It's not a bad thing. It's just that there is this distinction where someone may not be doing very much wholesomeness, and that's okay. As with all of the Buddha's teaching, the focus is on the bad things as a actionable focus. Just like with a doctor, the focus is always going to be on the sickness. If there's a sickness, we're doing everything in relation to the sickness. The reason why you might take care of your body, you might exercise, you might eat well, it's all related to getting rid of sickness and preventing sickness. So we don't worry too much about the good things. On the other hand, that being said, the Buddha said become full of wholesomeness, and that also means being full of good deeds. For the simple fact, as I said, the simple fact that if you're not performing good deeds, your mind will incline automatically towards doing bad deeds. In order to prevent the mind, or to keep the mind focused on wholesomeness, to prevent the mind from getting caught up in unwholesomeness, it behooves us to constantly try our best to perform as much goodness as we can. Goodness in Buddhism, in brief, I won't go into great detail, but there are three kinds of goodness. One is dana, which is charity or generosity. Two is sila, which is ethics. Of course, that relates to the not doing evil deeds. And bhavana, which is meditation. With good deeds, we're really mostly focused here on dana. We can think of it as the many different kinds of charity or generosity. It can be material donations, even as monks sharing our alms food with each other. It of course relates to how lay people give alms to the monks. But there are of course many, many opportunities for material generosity. Sharing with friends and children, parents, supporting other people. It can also be through action. It can be through helping others, supporting them physically, supporting them mentally, supporting them emotionally. And of course the support can be immaterial, so it can be sharing knowledge, even sharing the Dhamma, even printing or spreading the Buddha's teaching, recording videos, and rather than just keeping the Dhamma to yourself and sharing it with others. And again, as I said in another talk, we're not really concerned with dedicating our lives to helping others, because of course that would be a fool's errand. You can never find a limit. If your dedication in life is to help others, where do you set a limit? Of course we do as much as we can, as much as is appropriate. But being full of good doesn't mean going out of your way to spend all of your time sharing the Dhamma or doing good deeds. Ultimately, both the non-performance of evil deeds and the performance of good deeds is for the purpose of purifying the mind. The ultimate goal in Buddhism, of course, is the purification of one's own mind. And that's when I said what's so special about this is what it does contain. Because generally speaking, you'll find elements of these first two in most major religions. I would say every religion has elements of description of what is good and what is bad, and they get it wrong often. So many religions will teach that killing is okay, for example. Some religions teach that unwholesomeness towards people outside of your religion is not as bad as unwholesomeness towards people inside your religion. They get a lot of things wrong. But generally speaking, they will teach people how to be good and teach people to avoid evil. Religion has good elements. Most other religions have some goodness to them. But what they all lack, without exception, besides Buddhism, is the complete instruction on how to purify the mind. Even those few examples where you will see meditation practice or the practice of mental cultivation, they only get to what we would call the first level of purification. So in Buddhism there are two kinds of purification. The first kind, which isn't unique to Buddhism, is called Jeta Vimutti. Jeta Vimutti means the purification or the liberation of the mind, when you liberate the mind from defilements. And that sounds like enough, and this is the mistake that is often made. The purification of the mind, as we know from the Visuddhimagga, which is based on the Rattavinita Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya, that the purification of mind is only the second of 7 purifications. It's only the very beginning. You can only begin to purify. You've only have begun to purify your mind. We've only begun on the path of purification when you've purified the mind. So. And what does that mean? Why is it not enough to purify the mind? Because the mind is a momentary thing. And yes, you need a pure mind in order to become enlightened, but you need the effect or the result of having a pure mind, and you need to have the activity of applying that pure mind to ordinary reality. So that's the point. The point is that the pure mind is an instrument, and it allows you to gain the more important thing, which is called Panya Vimutti. Panya Vimutti means liberation through wisdom. Because of course, even though your mind might be pure, and might be pure for minutes or hours or days on end, if you continuously practice meditation, come to a meditation center or go to any ashram or any monastery in Christianity or Buddhism, you can spend great lengths of time in pure states where you've secluded your mind from any kind of unwholesomeness. But without the second type of purification, which is only found in the Buddhist teaching, anytime you return back to encounter objects of desire or aversion or any kind of opportunity for delusion, these defilements will quickly come back and can come back in full force and can be developed as bad habits once more. This is why the Buddha taught so much about ordinary reality, because he taught us not to necessarily seclude ourselves or try and escape from reality, not to focus just on things that aren't related to ordinary experience. And instead he taught us to be mindful of the ordinary experiences, but also mindful of the qualities of mind, even mindful of the unwholesome qualities of mind. So rather than try to suppress the hindrances, just learning to face them. And this is what we do, of course, through the practice of mindfulness. This is the crucial distinction between sati, the practice of satipatthana vipassana, and ordinary meditation practice. In some ways, what we practice doesn't even feel like meditation to other people. Those outside of Buddhism or those who have practiced in other traditions will come to practice satipatthana vipassana and feel that something's missing, because we're not secluding the mind. We're not escaping ordinary reality. We're not interested in this escape only. We're trying to purify the mind, find Jeta Vimutti, but to purify the mind based on ordinary experience. And so it's quite a different, it's a different experience. It feels different to the practitioner. The Buddha's teaching on purification of the mind involves the understanding, not the aversion or the avoidance of those things that we cling to, but the understanding that they aren't worth clinging to in the first place. So we face our experiences, we face anything that we might like or dislike, anything we might attach to or identify with, anything that might be a cause for greed, anger, or delusion, anything that might be a cause, a potential trigger for unwholesomeness of mind. And we face those things and we study them. We create a clear mind, but we create a clear mind based on those experiences so that we can look at them and see them as impermanent, unsatisfying, uncontrollable. And when we do that, we reach a purification which is the true purification of the mind that the Buddha taught. It's based on ultimate reality, and because it's based on wisdom, it doesn't require seclusion. It doesn't require us to live in the forest. Though, of course, someone who has gained understanding is much less inclined to get caught up in the artificial world of cities and human society. They're much more interested in living in a way that is real and natural and simple. Simple like the Buddha's teaching. So again, this is a very important teaching. It may not seem like much, but I think a lot of the Buddha's teaching doesn't seem like much. And the real challenge is learning to let go of all the complexity in our minds so that we can live a simple life and be in a very simple relationship with reality. It is what it is. Good is good, evil is evil, and the purity of the mind is something that is indisputable. There's no wiggle room. You can't rationalize away unwholesomeness. It's either wholesome or it's unwholesome. So that's the teaching of all the Buddhas, and that's the Dhamma for today.